Kadi, and I'm going to be talking about two films, Left Behind 2000 by Vic Sarin and Left Behind 2014 by Vic Armstrong. So I'm going to be talking about these films under a religious context, just because the first movie was an evangelical project. So I want to talk about them in a methodological, theological, and ideological context, and just kind of looking at the differences between the two since they were made at such different times, and the second one is meant to be a direct remake. So Vic Sarin's Left Behind, which is a 2000s version, is kind of a movie following a pilot named Ray Steele, and he leaves his family on his son's birthday, which causes some distress because he has to go on a flight, and we find out that he's kind of having an affair with the flight attendant, and then he's on the plane and some of the passengers disappear, and then we find out that a bunch of passengers have actually disappeared, a bunch of people have actually disappeared on Earth, and mostly it's children, and then they kind of figure out later that it's children and people who believe in God. And we're kind of following Ray Steele and his daughter's storyline as they kind of try to figure out what happened to the mom and their son. And then we're also following a news anchor who kind of covers a bunch of like wild things. Like at the beginning he's in Israel and there's like some bombings and explosions happening, but like he's right in the middle of it, and everyone kind of commends him for being in the middle of action all the time. We're following him, and then they kind of get together and they create this like force to like beat the Antichrist, who is in the form of the head of the UN, who later gets everyone in the room, and he cuts down the people in the UN to like 10 people. He kills one of the main people that was opposing him, and he brainwashes everyone else into believing his story. And that's the end of that movie. So this movie kind of takes a look at the apocalypse and what it would look like in the modern world. So like it looks at like the geopolitical reactions to the rapture, like everyone disappearing and everyone who believes in God disappearing, what that looks like from like the UN's perspective of like world leaders disappearing specifically, and like how the world kind of reacts and how it reshapes itself when that happens. And so it also kind of like shows you what during 2000 what they thought apocalypse would look like, in that like there's scarce resources, and like they're kind of worried at the time about like overpopulation, people using up all the resources. So then the main issue at the UN at the time is using technology to get more food, and like what good that can be, and like how much power the person that creates that will hold over humanity. And then on the mythological perspective, the myth of the apocalypse is kind of different in this film, because it's not necessarily technological failure or like zombies or something like that. It's more of like God, like this is something that will always happen according to the faith of like the world ending, which is something that's kind of scary in a way because it's inevitable and you can't run away from it, especially thinking that this is the rapture, so it's the beginning of the end. And like Christian doctrine of salvation talks a lot about like the innocent and the people that believe in God disappearing, and that's exactly what happens in this film, and they're taken before the doom begins. There's a lot of talk about faith in the movie, and it shows a lot of visuals of God, and like there's churches and crosses all over the film, and there are a lot of like quiet moments within the church, and there's an end scene visual of the church kind of just being there just to make you feel that like religious vibe to it. I think that if the religious elements weren't in there, like the Bible scene where Ray Steele takes his wife's Bible and then he throws it at the glass and then he picks it up and he begins to read it, it kind of would just seem like any other rapture film where or apocalypse film where like something happens and then suddenly the world is ending. But this makes it really religious, and it makes sure that the movie's message of you should believe in God because at the end of the world, like you will be saved if you believe in God, kind of goes through with that. So moving on to the Left Behind 2014 by the other Vic Armstrong. So in this movie, it's mostly taking place in the airplane that Ray Steele is in. So like that's Nicolas Cage's character. This film is not very good. Ray Steele he's a boring character in the first Left Behind, and he's an even more boring character in the second Left Behind. And I say boring not because like he is boring, which he is, but also because he's not well developed, and he's not as like he's not deep enough, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So like for Vic Armstrong's version, he's even less deep, if that makes sense. So he kind of jumps from being a sinner because he commits adultery to being this man who like is suddenly believing in God and like super faithful. And there's no time between that. At least in the first film, there's like off-screen time where we assume that he reads the whole Bible, and like at the end he's like reciting verses, so like we kind of guess that he's like educated himself about that. But like in this one, there's not much. There's just him in the airplane, and like at some point he's super religious just because like his flight attendant that disappeared had like a cross that like his wife also had. I don't know. Yeah, so like the movie kind of also makes his daughter more adult, and like makes her kind of have this like romantic affiliation with the news anchor that we were talking about earlier. Weird movie. Okay, so like the ideological topics in this film are just like, I think that the film haphazardly touches on a bunch of issues like drug addiction and gambling and promiscuity, but it does it in a way where it's like every type of sin that can happen is in the airplane. And like I think making the setting like very much in the airplane kind of ruins the whole like ideological views that the first film gave us. So like the first film was talking about like geopolitical reactions to the rapture and like how people are changing or not changing because of the rapture. But in this film, we just kind of have this isolated image, and we know that it's happening everywhere else because some characters tell us that. And the daughter and the news anchor are out there like telling us that. But we don't see much of that, and we just see like a bunch of characters that stand for other groups of people in the plane. Yeah, but I think it's overplayed, but I think that what they're trying to do is to reflect on the sins that are growing bigger in the modern world, like drug addiction and gambling and promiscuity. But another interesting character on the plane was a Muslim man, and this was weird because I think they could have gone two good ways with this, which is like either talking about questions of like, is there one true God? And if there is one true God, then like, will certain people of certain faiths go to heaven in the rapture, but not other people? Or they could have talked about like stereotypes of brown and Muslim people on planes, because like they kind of mentioned that where they're like, do you have a bomb? Did you do this? And then he's like, I didn't do this. And they kind of mention that, but then they kind of move on from that. And in the end, he's not saved, even though he clearly believes in God and he talks about it a lot. And he like mumbles a lot of like phrases to himself about God. So it's just kind of interesting that they put that in there, and it seems a little targeted and problematic to me. From a theological perspective though, this film has only a few references, like very brief, as compared to all the church visuals that we see in the first one. So we don't see as many, and they're not as clear as they should be, I think. Yeah, we see the Bible at one point, or 2 points, and the other one might be the Quran, but other than that, not really. So for the mythological perspective, we also don't get that much. So we have like the myth of the apocalypse as like a general starting point for the film, but we don't get much of like impact of the rapture, and we don't get as much in-depth talk about why this matters, like why the film matters, why like what the message of the film is. So if the message of the first film is to be, you should believe in God because in the rapture, God, you will be saved because you believe in God, then what is the message in the second film? You should believe in God, but the plane landed and we're gonna be fine now, I guess. And people who believe in God went, but not all people who believed in a God, just people who believed in our God. I don't know. But yeah, I think that this film, the second film, would have been much better if it had been an exact remake, but updated for the time. And like, I think so much changed from 2000 to 2014, like 9/11 specifically, and I think they could have done much more with that. That was more thoughtful and meaningful, especially if they have gone outside of the plane more and like they'd like stepped into what the other film tried to do more, which is like going into the UN and like international relations. Yeah, I would have just been interested to see what stays the same and what changes in how we react to the rapture 14 years apart. But yeah, this has been me talking, kind of rambling about Left Behind 2000 and Left Behind 2014 by Vic Sarin and Vic Armstrong, respectively. I liked the first film. It was interesting. It was a little awkward at sometimes and a little bit slow, but liked the first film. Did not like the second film. Bad acting. I looked it up on Google to find some images and it said, is Left Behind 2014 the worst movie ever made? And that's a question that I'm gonna leave you with. Okay.